welcome to a live, in-person Scholar Gypsies podcast. Of the existing MEPs that have a seat in your constituencies, whose voter base do you think aligns best with some of the topics and agendas that you're talking about?
I'm not sure that there's a clear answer to that question, Jerry. I don't know that any particular candidate is, in a certain sense, an opponent of mine. That we're doing something different. We're not fighting other people. We're fighting to gain a position where we can voice certain things. And I think that doesn't necessarily, is not confined ideologically, it's not confined in party terms, it's quite an open thing, I think. I think one of the things we're learning is that this country has been subject to what I call a mutism for quite a few years, maybe about a decade, going back to, I would say, 10 years ago, 2014, it started just before the so-called marriage referendum, where certain individuals started to decide that, you know, they could function in this society by stopping other people having a voice, by stopping other people having meetings, by stopping people having a right to speak their minds. And that became very infectious in the years afterwards and has become now a standard practice in our former democracy. And so I think that has driven a lot of people underground. And so it's only when you give them the permission. I find this actually when I go around the place now and I do certain things in order to provoke people, like in a garage, you know, somebody behind the counter and you have a little bit of chit chat about certain things and you kind of just then drop a little truth bomb or drop a little question about a conspiracy theory, you know, of some kind, like maybe talk about the weather, and you say, do you think the weather is natural? And the natural? Are you having a laugh? You know, I find that you can't really predict the outcomes, and you can't predict where that's going to be coming from. But there is a radical change in the last few months. If not, certainly the maximum over a year. I think a year ago it was static from 2020, 21, 22. I think up to a year ago it was static, and now it's in total free fall. And I don't know where it will end. I think that we really, the only question area I have in mind is, are we too early to catch the moment? The moment has not peaked yet. It's heading towards some kind of critical moment, some tipping point. And the question is, will that tipping point coincide with the 7th of June?
We only have one piece of evidence that there's a movement in the country that's going in our direction. And that piece of evidence is the referendum results in March. Do you see that there was a lot more packed into those two no votes than just the topic of the day?
Well, yes, Jerry, I'd like to think so, but then maybe that's the optimist in me, is hoping that is indeed the case. But I do feel that there was a genuine resurgence of sort of that patriotic spirit, you know, that, you know, a realization that the government were in fact lying to the people. And I think that's hugely profound. And I do feel that this will benefit those of us who are non-party candidates in particular. When I say non-party, I mean especially the three major parties, the government parties. And as independents, I think we will benefit from that. Yes, I do think there has been an awakening of the Irish people as a result of that vote. And I think they realised that they were not alone. Over 70% of voters voted against the government, which means they did not trust the government you know, a stance on this, and that's hugely significant. So I think we need to capitalise on that. I'm hoping to capitalise on that. So I think now is the era of the independents. And the great advantage, of course, of being an independent is that you're not subject to a party whip. You can truly be yourself and align with your constituents and their demands.
You're both running as European candidates. That requires quite a number of votes. You know, I think your campaign manager, we were having a chat about it one week, it's like 70,000 votes. Now, most of the people in the room here are familiar with you and getting more familiar with you. What would you say to the maybe 40,000 people you need to vote for you, who might recognise a name, but not necessarily, and who are open to hearing what you have to say, how would you direct your conversation towards those people?
I would say something like, well, wouldn't it be nice if your public representative was actually your public representative, as opposed to the representative of foreign interests or invisible interests, or secret interests? And wouldn't it be nice if your public representative actually tried to reflect your views and talk about what you feel and what you desire? And then I would point to what is obvious, that our political system has become really corrupted beyond imagination in terms of, you talk about the chicanery of politics, and I've got to put my hand up there because I wrote about politics for many, many years in various newspapers, and I always kind of in a certain sense celebrated that kind of slightly kind of risque element of politics in Ireland, the kind of culturism. And now I look back, and in fact I wrote a book, my first book was about that, Driving at the Crossroads, which was kind of like about, that whole kind of way that politicians go, and the way that certain kind of prudish interests in Dublin or whatever might sort of look down their noses at, but nevertheless which is part of the actual theatre of politics. And now I kind of regard myself as having, in a certain sense, I look at that book and I'm not sure I can stand over it in this present moment, because the political system has become so utterly corrupted and so hostile to the people that I say to people, your system has turned rogue against you. It is deeply, profoundly corrupt, and it is not in any sense a democratic system, even though they seem to use the word democracy and democratic more now than they ever did before. But you see that what's actually happened there is they've changed the definition of democracy. It used to be that democracy meant the sovereignty of the people being expressed electorally, etc., and your representatives go into Parliament and they make laws on your behalf, and then they elect a government to implement those laws and so on. That's not what they mean by democracy now. What they mean now by democracy is democratic structures, and that they, as the inhabitants of those structures, are in effect the personification, the incarnation of democracy, and they're very persona. So in other words, by questioning them, you are questioning democracy, you see. The idea, therefore, the very principle of democracy, which was contestable elections, is almost regarded as old-fashioned and infra-dig. That we have a situation where they speak about any opposition as though it were terrorism, any questioning as though it were terrorism. And they try to demonize any voice of opposition as this appalling, almost like ludicrous label of far right and all this nonsense that you have to hear. And journalists, of course, write these words into their articles because I think they're paid on the basis of many times they use the term far right and anti-vaxxer and all this kind of stuff, that their bonuses are stitched into that particular kind of formula, I believe. And so I think that we're in a really dangerous place in this context because, as I said when I was speaking earlier, there was a coup, an autogolpe, it's a Spanish word for self-coup, in 2011, I believe. And that the meaning of that is that they want to thereby continue the regime that is that happens there in different forms, perhaps. And if you look at the history of what's happened since in Irish politics, essentially nothing has changed at all. We've had several changes of government, several changes of Taoiseach, but we started off with somebody who in 2011 who had an overall majority, a really huge one. We now end up with a guy who got elected on the 15th count. And it's the same agenda, the same narrative, the same line, the same ideology that's been implemented. And that's the point of the coup, that it doesn't matter who's in government. And if you look to the future, even as things stand now, unless this intervention that we're talking about can succeed, you're going to end up with another party coming into that central mix, Sinn Féin, which is in its own way distinguishable from the other the big beasts, only to the extent that it is worse.
I'd like you to take up on that point as well.
Yeah. What I would say to the voters in Ireland South is look at the voting pattern of your current MEPs. Look to see to what extent, if any, have they represented your interests in Europe, or are they representing the interests of the globalists and the parties that they serve? And I'm speaking, for example, with regard to that pseudo-restoration, nature restoration law. The first part of that was made possible because it was voted on by all of the MEPs. There is the EU Asylum and Migration Pact. They voted for that as well. Have they told you about any of the measures coming down the tracks that might be important for the Irish people to know about? Like, for example, the proposed pandemic treaty. You know, did they tell you about the implications of the COVID pass, for example? I mean, what information is coming back from Europe, from these MEPs, that's relevant to the Irish people and or their constituents? I can't see of any. It's almost as if when they get elected, they disappear to Brussels and we don't hear about them until about 6 months before the actual election date, which is what's happening at the moment. And I think basically that this just is not good enough.
One of John's opponents, Ming Flanagan, had taken out an ad in the Galway Advertiser on the front page last week or the week before, which said his advertisement was, "What does Ming Flanagan do?" With a QR code.
Good question.
So he doesn't actually even go to the bother of telling you until you scan in your phone.
Yeah, Jerry, how do you know I didn't take out that?
Just one point on that I just wanted to say. First of all, almost 70% of the laws now that are relevant to this country come from the EU. 70% or more of the legislative measures come from the EU. So it's hugely important in that regard. Almost every agenda, every policy, whether it's transgenderism, whatever it is, it either emanates from or is funneled or channeled through the EU. So what happens in the EU is hugely important, and none of our MEPs are informing us of any of these matters. We have to find it out ourselves. John and I have been doing the research on this, and really it's very serious what's coming down the line, and I think it's, and I have to make this point, that none of them have done their job. It's their duty to inform the Irish people about what's happening in Europe. They're supposed to be our representatives in Europe. The purpose of them being there is to tell us what's going on in Europe. What are the agendas? What's coming down the line? What do we need to know about here in Ireland that we can prepare for? But what's happening is they voted on it by the time we get to find out about it, and it's too late. And that's just not good enough.
I completely agree. A very good question to ask in this context. What might be the difference between the way things are and a situation whereby we had no MEPs at all? Would there be any difference whatever in what's happening in our country with regard to laws coming from Europe? I don't think so. I'm not aware of any MEP who has made a significant stand on any of the things that matter, the things that are destroying the fabric of our country. If we're going to be in a parliament, if you're going to go and represent your people, then you need to speak there, obviously loudly enough to be heard at home, and you need to speak at home about the impact this is having and what we need to do about it.
Like, I think at a certain point, we didn't take the European election seriously in terms of who. It was almost like a retirement home for people to go to and draw down a nice salary and, but the second issue, and you triggered in my head is, and it's a question, are you prepared for the huge onslaught of regulations, directives, the paperwork of the European Union in terms of, paragraph here, subsection there, a line that matches with another piece of legislation from 2 years ago. The sheer volume of reading that's required of all our MEPs and you, and I suppose that's the side question I'd ask John is, will you be able to get your Substack out on a Friday?
Well, Jerry, I was a member of the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland for 10 years, and you want to see the boxes of stuff that would arrive in my house on a Friday evening for a meeting on Monday. Those red boxes that the ministers used to have in the UK, they were tiny by comparison, and I would have spent my weekend waiting to it. So I'm no stranger to bureaucracy, but I think that, this is, you see, when these guys go to Europe, it's like as if, it's a reward, it's a retirement home. It reflects the impotence of the political system in Ireland to what happens in Europe, the behaviour of these guys. It's because it's like they're not really active politicians. They're not active speakers in Ireland, not active intellectuals in Ireland. They're not active, anything in Ireland. And there's therefore a complete disconnection between Ireland and them once they're elected. Our friend Ming, I heard a good line in a cafe yesterday. Somebody asked another guy about Ming, and he said, Ming was great until he got in.
But he had to do something.
Yeah. And that's the thing. That's one thing we must be absolutely certain that we do not fall into, that we were greater before we were than we were when we got in. Because the point is to be great when we get in and actually do something about what's happening.
Well, I suppose, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Una, on that, but also it also raises another kind of question, is when we elect candidates who don't have actually the capability to do the job, they then become reliant on a swarm of advisors and influences who basically explain it with their narrative and their agenda, and Paddy Irishman is there, where do I sign kind of thing. Is that an issue?
Well, can I just say that? Sorry, Nuno, but I remember actually recently a certain politician in the western half of the country was talking about, voting for the hate speech laws here in Ireland and complaining that, these terrible laws that he'd already voted for were now being pushed. And none of the journalists asked him, said, "But you voted them. What happened? Like, how did this?" Did you actually read the papers? Of course, the answer is no, he didn't. And he was more or less saying as much implicitly.
I think, in fact, he did say that he hadn't actually read it.
Yeah.
Which says a lot. So just with regard to the first point, I'm sure John will continue to do his Substack. It'll just be called the EU Substack. And I'll continue to do my videos. So that's, I think, how we'll deal with the European situation. But you make a very good point, Jerry, because yes, of course, all these rules and regulations and laws, they're very complex. There's no doubt about that. I've looked at them myself, and I am a lawyer and I'm used to doing this. They're very complex. I feel they're deliberately complex. It's like the whole business of lawmaking now, whether it's in national parliaments or in the EU, it's designed to be complex so that you won't have time to look at it or read it. And of course, there is always the risk that if you're not a strong-minded person and you're not alert to what's happening or coming down the line, that you could easily be very influenced. And of course, this is the danger of voting for people who are members of political parties. I'm talking about the main parties now, I'm not talking about the smaller ones. There's lots of wonderful people, standing in election for the smaller parties who haven't been in power before. I'm talking about the three main parties, the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and especially the Green Party, that these people will be told to follow the party line. And they will say, well, what's the view of Dublin? What do headquarters say about this particular legislative measure here? Well, sure, we'll have to vote for it, won't we? And that's the end of it. So there's no independent thought process. To get any kind of job now in Ireland that's in any way remotely connected to the public service, which is practically every job, unless you're self-employed, you have to demonstrate your capacity for critical thinking. Critical thinking. How many people in positions of power or governance during COVID do you know who exercised critical thinking? And I'll just leave that thought there. And some of these people are in the EU at the moment as we speak. So my concern is that the ones who have been there for the last 5 years and the ones who are running next time round have abandoned their critical thinking capabilities, and they're just doing what they're told to do by party headquarters. That's no good for the Irish people, because the effect of it is that we have been ceding our sovereignty incrementally, both on an individual level and on a national level, to the EU, and it's very, very serious. And we're only waking up to that now. And the reason why we're in this position is because so many of our MEPs were either asleep at the wheel, or they deliberately went along with a party line and they knew what they were doing. I don't know which it is, but either situation is simply not acceptable.
That's why you get people not reading bills, because there's no point in reading them. You actually just find out what is the right answer, and you take that position. It's like with the Lisbon Treaty thing. Well, sorry lads, you got the wrong answer, so now you're going to have to do it again. Well, next time you learn, well, let's just do it right the first time by not looking things up, not inquiring into anything, and just saying whatever we're told to say.
We probably all agree the number one issue on the doorstep, whether it be European or local, maybe don't agree, is immigration. Now, it's a nuanced topic, I believe, with a number of different layers, but most visibly, and what we've seen over the last 2 years, is a out of control refugee and asylum seeker policy. And I want to get you to maybe talk about what your views are on this and what you might hope to achieve as European parliamentarians on the subject.
In all of these questions, particularly in an inflammatory and topic like this, in order to get to really what's happening, you have to start asking yourself, well, what words are they most interested to ban? What are the words that they don't want us to use? And in this context, there is one word which they absolutely don't want you to use, and that word is replacement. And that tells me that that's the whole purpose. Their anxiety to stop us using that word tells me that replacement is the right word, and the only word we really need to focus on, that's what's happening to our country. Its population is being replaced. Last year, 100,000 young Irish people applied for visas in Australia alone. They're meeting their replacements at the airport. To say otherwise is nonsense. To suggest that it's about anything.
I think I would have to agree with John there, definitely. Now, it's a hugely complex area, as we know, and one could spend hours and hours talking about it because there's different aspects to it. There's the student visas, there's the fact that citizens of the EU can come and work here anytime they want, there's the international protection applicants, and then there's the illegal immigrants, and then there's lack of coherent migration policy. So all of these issues are sort of playing into each other, and it makes it all very, very confusing. And I think it is shocking that our young people, all my nieces and nephews now, are working and living from home. It's just unacceptable that this is happening, and I don't like it one little bit, but I think we need to call a halt, because we've had the Geneva Conventions, you see, which are very important to deal with genuine asylum seekers. And I use the word genuine asylum seekers. And there really wasn't an issue with regard to the issue of genuine asylum seekers. But now we know that that is not the case. We know that most of the immigrants are really economic immigrants. And in fact, it really is a giant human trafficking scam that's organized and orchestrated by agents who are working for external forces. And it's, this is really what's going on. And if I know this, then the government knows this.
But I would go further and say the government is the primary people trafficker in this operation.
The government are facilitating it in Ireland. They're not necessarily driving it at an international level.
Oh, I don't agree, Una. I mean, they went around the world advertising in multiple languages for people, offering houses and money and everything. In a country which has 12,000 people without houses, Irish people without houses, they went advertising free houses all over the world in multiple languages.
Yes, they did that, but they did that as the agents of their globalist masters.
Oh, yeah.
So that is the point. Yeah. And yes, I agree with you. And Rodrigo Gorman did that. He sent out tweets in 8 languages, including Arabic. I mean, how many Arabic people do you think are in the world? How do you think an Arab living in dire economic circumstances being shown that on a phone by a friend of his? Oh my goodness, you must come to Ireland. They have all sorts of wonderful benefits happening in Ireland. And 2 of those languages that were used in those tweets sent out by Rodrigo Gorman were Georgian and Albanian. Coincidentally, both of those countries are considered to be safe countries by Ireland, which means that there's no wars going on there, and that if anyone comes from those countries, now they can still of course apply for asylum, but they have a much higher threshold. But Rodrigo Gorman did this, and I often wonder how many of those poor unfortunate men, sleeping in their own urine outside Mount Street are here because of those tweets by Rodrigo Gorman, and that it's unconscionable that this man is still a government minister after what he's done.
I agree 100%. I mean, this all is based, it rests on lies and bullying. It rests on all kinds of lies by all kinds of interests. It's a massive industry. It's an industry of destruction. It is the destruction of Ireland. It's systematic destruction. There's no doubt about it. Anybody involved in this must know that that's what they're doing. Because when you open Ireland's gates and place no limit on the number of people who can come in, then, well, how are you going to stop it? We can see now they're not able to stop it. You see, this is the thing where all this nonsense started about racism. We had an organic flow of people into Ireland for all kinds of reasons, the normal organic reasons that people would want to come to a different country. And those people were always welcome. But we had laws and we had visas and we had borders, and we enforced those borders. And now what they're trying to do is they operate this criminal scheme to flood our country with indifferent aliens and say that there's no difference between this and what was actually happening organically. There's a world of difference. They're two entirely different things. And there's no way, this way that they smear people just because, that they say, well, you're opposed to immigration. Most people are not opposed to immigration. They're opposed to criminal mass migration imposed by their government using state coercion, which is licensed from the people whose lives are being destroyed.
That's right.
And the people are being gaslit by their government, and also, Irish people, in my view, are the kindest people in the world. There's no doubt about that, and they would have no issue with anybody being here who was a genuine refugee. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing young single males being brought into centres under cover of darkness with armed Gardaí escorts. It's understandable why people would be concerned about these issues. There's something not right about that, and everybody knows it. So I think really we need to have a national debate on this issue, because as we all know, it's very nuanced, and there are many genuine people here and genuine asylum seekers. There are also very many migrants here who have been here on visas, and they're doing wonderful work, and we meet them in service stations all over Ireland, in restaurants, they're in phone shops, and they're wonderful people making a contribution to Ireland. So nobody has an issue about that. So let's forget about being accused of being a racist here. This isn't about that. This is a genuine concern that Irish people have about the fact that they are being replaced, and that their young Irish people are having to go to Australia or other countries to get work, and they're being replaced by these
exactly.
people.
I mean, what we need to start looking at is the economic model, which on the one hand seems to favour the importation of vast numbers of outsiders, while also favouring the export of vast numbers of our own young people. I mean, the first and foremost duty of a government is to provide for its own people. What is our government doing to provide for the people who are being forced to leave our country, and instead actually bringing in outsiders? Now I'll tell you something, there's a very interesting thing to be said about this, that this has got to do in many respects with the particular moment we are at in the history of money, that we are approaching the supernova of the money systems of the West, the dollar, sterling and the euro. They're on the point of collapse. And in that period of prior to the supernova, there's a period in which money becomes ubiquitous, because there's no point in not spending money of this kind. But this also means that there are now two kinds of money in existence in our society. One is the kind of money which we are used to all our lives, our tax money, the money that is spent on services and so on, the money that is, for example, used to fill potholes and build hospitals, let's say. Now that money continues to be as scarce as it ever was in Ireland. You can't get a pothole fixed. You can't get a bed in a hospital. But The other kind of money, which is the supernova money, the money for of the burning out fiat systems of the West, that money is limitless at this moment. And that money is being used entirely for destruction, entirely for funding operations which are destroying the very fabric of Western civilization. And this is not an accident. This is not a collateral consequence of bad policy or bad ideas. This is a deliberate strategy to take down the West, to destroy, to demolish the West. And they say, in the language of the mother wefers, to build back better. Well, I say to build back far worse. Yeah. Because they want to build back essentially an open-air prison that the people of the West will be imprisoned within, digitally and otherwise, by money, by work or lack of it, by lack of capacity to travel, whether it's in your car or in an airplane, and essentially with the life that our children will face, and our children's children, if they are indeed even living on this island anymore, if they haven't been driven off of it by the influx of outsiders that now is threatening to dominate this island into the infinite future. Unless that we can actually get to the bottom of this and turn this juggernaut around, our nation is actually on the point of obliteration.
If our government had any genuine interest in resolving this issue or dealing with it, they would allow, facilitate and enable a public debate on the issue, and they have persistently refused. And as some of you will know, I've been doing a series of videos in the last while on the EU and Migration Pact, and what I've called for is a public debate to debate all of these issues. We're entitled to have a debate on this, and I've also asked for publication of the Attorney General's advice and the advice of senior government officials in the Department of Justice in relation to this EU Migration Pact. And they have refused. And even though Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, at one point said, oh yes, we should have a debate, and then the following week, when the Rural Independents tabled a motion for that very reason, and there was a counter motion by the government parties, and unfortunately the opposition lost the vote. So I don't know where that stands at the moment, but it's really important to say, and I know those of you who've listened to my videos will be aware of this, but for those who haven't, what's very significant with regard to the whole issue of migration and asylum is that we opted out of that really way back with the Treaty of Amsterdam, and that's contained now in the Treaty of Lisbon by reference to Protocol 21. Which means that when the EU makes laws effectively in the area of asylum or migration, Ireland is opted out, so to speak, and we don't opt in unless we have a vote in the Dáil on this issue. So that vote has yet to take place. But because the vote hasn't taken place, we are not actually bound by the terms of the EU Asylum and Migration Pact, unlike all other EU states, except Denmark, because they also had an opt-out. So this is a golden opportunity and a great window to have a public debate about this issue. But of course, the government will not allow it. Why? Because they have already committed diplomatically, or at the highest levels diplomatically within the EU, because they're working with and for the EU, to agree to this EU and Asylum Migration Pact. So as far as they're concerned, it's a done deal because they feel they have the numbers. So I and others have been fighting, as you know, for the last few weeks. You might have seen some of the videos, to try and stop this, because you know, one of the measures that's part of that pact is very serious. It really will mean that we will have no control over relocations of asylum seekers. This will be determined by a central body in the EU. And the consequence of that is that we will effectively lose our sovereignty. We will have open borders. We will have no control over our borders. And a country that has no control over its borders has lost its sovereignty. I mean, we've already given away our sovereignty in public health to a large extent with regard to the Lisbon Treaty. This is the last last vestige that we have with regard to migration, and it's so important. And I did say to people when doing those videos, please lobby your local TDs as much as you can. You've got to get them to halt this process, because it could change our country forever. It will change it demographically and every other way. So the consequences are very serious. So,
well, I just want to make, there was a very important point here about the debate question, because this is going on now for 30 years, talking about debate. We are entitled to have a debate. We must have a debate. We should have a debate. But we never have a debate. And the very minute that anybody starts to try to raise the most fundamental questions, which I raised 20 odd years ago, a very fundamental question: how many? What's the limit? How do we reach that limit, and what happens when we've reached it? So, okay, I say to people, well, how many? And they say, well, you know, we don't know. Okay, well, let's try and figure. So I say, how about 1 million? Oh, don't be ridiculous. Okay, so do I get it that it's less than 1 million? Okay. Dozen. No, you're just taking, no. Okay, so somewhere between a dozen and 1 million. Okay, let's fix a figure, right? Okay, let's say we figure we arrive at is 500,203. Okay? Okay, and we take them all in. And you're welcome, sir. Come on, off you go there. Here's your house, here's your keys, off you go. Right? Now, on one Monday morning, the 500,204th guy comes off the plane. Can I, or the person who is representing me as a citizen, say to that gentleman, I'm very sorry, sir. God, it's only a pity you didn't come yesterday. But now you're going to have to go home because we've reached our quota. And can we do that without being called racist by gobshites? That was the question I want, and that question still lives. The intake of migrants will be related to GDP. The problem with this for Ireland, we always get suckered by all these things, because why? Our GDP reflects the transnational economy in Ireland, which has nothing to do with our life, our people's life, or anything. So we will be taking in migrants on the basis of the profits of multinational corporations who just happen to headquarter themselves here and wash their money from all their operations globally through the laundry system that is Ireland now.